welcome to this afternoon's session of the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee, and it is our final session on building support for the energy transition. Welcome to panel one. You can introduce yourselves, starting on this side, please.
Hello, I'm Judicaelle Hammond. I'm the Director of Policy and Advice at the Country Land and Business Association, also known as the CLA. We represent over 20,000 members in England and Wales who operate and own rural land-based businesses in England and Wales.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Neil Morisetti, former sailor, former diplomat, now Professor of Climate and Resource Security at University College London, although the views I give this afternoon are very much my own, based on my experience, including as the government's Climate and Energy Security Envoy and then the Foreign Secretary's Special Representative for Climate Change.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Marina Romanello. I'm an Associate Professor at the University College London. I'm also Executive Director of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change, and a member of the Climate Change Committee, Adaptation Committee. And again, I'm going to be speaking here on my own personal capacity today.
Well, thank you all very much indeed, and I will start the questions with asking about defence. So, Neil, this is your time to demonstrate the experience and the breadth of roles you've had in the past. We've been listening to NATO, we've been listening to various security analysts, and they're all saying the same things, that energy security is a very serious challenge internationally, let alone for this country. What is your view on the role of fossil fuels and the balance that should be struck between our reliance on oil and gas on the one hand and renewables on the other when it comes to national security?
Thank you. NATO is right to highlight the risks associated for the military in the sense of fossil fuels, but also many of those risks apply to civil society as well. That said, the military will be dependent on fossil fuels for some time to come. You know, the battery-powered tank might come one day, but it's a long way away. And the military needs to take action to reduce the risks, as does society as a whole. So in both instances, there's really a need for an energy strategy, one that looks at how much energy you use, whether it be in fuel or power, one that looks at the nature of and types you use, recognizing that if you're going to be using fossil fuels, you have to acknowledge that you are vulnerable in the sense that your supply chain may be at risk, and the price volatility depending on what's happening, as it's a fungible commodity. And in a world where there is a lot of global insecurity, the price will vary markedly, as we have seen in the past. At the same time, you need to think about if you've got the right technology as you move forward. If you move forward with renewables, and acknowledge with renewables that is not without risk, in the same way that we see geopolitical risk with fossil fuels, where it comes from, the fact that the price is affected by what's going on all around the world. There are certain critical minerals, rare earths required for renewable energy, and we need to understand that has constraints, and that can be weaponized, and we've seen China in the past restricting exports of certain natures and that sort of thing. So that has to be part of your consideration. You also need to be sure, whilst you are, particularly whatever it is, whether it's fossil fuels or it's critical minerals and renewables, that there is stability in the regions you're going to obtain them from, and that you need to look at your supply chain. And if you look at the impact of a changing climate, the areas in the world which are most affected by that, which tend to be in an equatorial belt, is where the world's supply trade routes run, where the supply lines for much of the fossil fuels that we use in the UK military and elsewhere come from.
Yeah, thank you very much. And back to your point about tanks, and the same is true for fighter aircraft and plenty else that the military relies on. One piece of evidence we had was that we should absolutely prioritise liquid fuels for military use. And do you agree with that? Do you agree that the case is that if we are moving to renewables in the energy transition, the priority and during the transition, that liquid fuels, military first, and renewables elsewhere?
Ultimately, if you need to use your military for a war of national survival, they need the kit and the equipment to enable them to do that. So in that sense, yes. But that doesn't mean that the military can't move away from the use of fossil fuels and then find alternatives. We saw it during the campaign in Afghanistan, where there was a move away from large fossil fuel convoys to where appropriate making use of renewables. Solar panels were used to charge batteries right up at the front line. US Marine Corps were using those. UK military in the UK needs power. It can get power from solar, it can get power from wind from the estate and elsewhere. So it's a combination. Yes, there are certain bits where you will need fossil fuel, but you can try and reduce the amount of fossil fuel you use, both through using power generated from renewable energy, but also from energy efficiency. Historically, whilst Richard Branson was taxing his aircraft on one engine, the Royal Air Force was taxing it on 4 engines. They can come down to 1 engine to taxi. That uses less fuel. Historically, every piece of kit that arrived had a diesel generator. So you had a row of diesel generators running on a third load, where you can cut that down to a third of those running on full load. And that sort of, so there's a change in behaviour patterns as well to reduce that demand.
Okay. And the North Sea has a mixture now of oil and gas and wind. What is the security threat from, whether it's from drones or from submarines or otherwise, to oil and gas installations or indeed to wind turbines, wind farms?
We've seen in Ukraine that Putin has targeted energy, whether it's big power stations, whether it's energy generation or whatever. And there's no reason to believe that an adversary wouldn't do that if we were in that sort of conflict. There is a risk. There's a risk in our grids from cyber and elsewhere, and we need to ensure that they're resilient, and we need to be alert to that. There's perhaps a degree of complacency, although progressively people are becoming more alert to the fact that we need to be more secure. We need to think about undersea cables and pipelines, etc.
Thank you. What should the government be doing that it's not already to make the case that there is a security dividend in moving away from oil and gas to renewables? You mentioned Ukraine. Should we be drawing on their example?
I think we should be. The government should be making it very clear that a traditional fossil fuel energy posture has a number of risks associated with it. That there are alternatives that can be used with renewable energy, etc. But in doing so, again, whether it is in the security context or in the wider society piece, there's certain prerequisites. The kit's got to be available, the people to fit the kit have got to be available, and those who operate it need to understand how to use it most effectively.
Thanks very much. Lizzie Collins.
Thank you very much. So I am interested in how farmers and the agricultural sector are plugged into this transition, and we know that that farming puts out a lot of methane and nitrous oxide, a bit less carbon in terms of percentages. So I'm going to go to Judicaelle first. Do you think that the current policies the government has are successfully incorporating farmers into that energy transition? And what do you think the barriers are for farmers and other agricultural businesses picking up those new technologies?
Thank you. So my members are both at the forefront, on the front line, if you like, of climate change, and also are solution providers. So in terms of being on the forefront, there's the weather. And the weather has been increasingly unpredictable. We've had too much water, too little water. That has had an impact on yields. It is going to continue to be the case. There is a program of decarbonisation of food production that DEFRA is running, including primary production, including methane, so we're talking ruminants here. But this is not the be-all and end-all, not least because there are issues of food waste which produce carbon emission as well, which need to be addressed. In terms of solution providing, there is forestry, of course, and other ways of capturing carbon from the atmosphere, which a lot of my members are already into and they're very interested in. And in terms of the energy transition, obviously, there is a great deal of interest in leasing land for solar and for wind now, but also in playing their part in terms of their own business by putting solar panels on their roofs, by going to electric machinery, and I'll respond to your question about barriers in a minute, by installing heat pumps in the cottages or the tourism accommodation that they might have, which many of them have. So in terms of barriers, I think cost of electric machinery is an issue. Access to charging for that machinery is a really big issue. And that is partly due to access to grid. Now, we know that the grid needs modernizing, and in rural areas, sometimes the village is at the end of the grid, and the grid hasn't been touched, potentially since the 1930s. So that is an issue. The other one is a lot of my members in the east of the country find themselves to be unwitting, and in some cases, unwilling infrastructure hosts, in the sense that while they themselves might not have renewable energy on their patch, they will be bisected by cabling routes and pylons that are taking energy from usually offshore wind turbines and bringing it back into the cities, and particularly the southeast.
Can I ask you about a specific technology? I have a constituency-based business that does anaerobic digestion and burning of methane. What are your thoughts on that technology and its use?
So anaerobic digestion certainly has a role to play because it is enabling the capture of some of the methane, and also, of course, it transforms what would be waste product back into something that can be used as nutrient source instead of manufactured nutrient source, some of which will come from countries with which we no longer have friendly relations. So I think it is really important to have a look at that and make sure that the technology evolves and becomes more efficient and effective, etc. Biomethane into the gas grid is something that my members are talking about a lot as well. And methane powered tractors, which is not very common, but I understand that it is being done.
Okay, thank you. And just finally, Chair, if I've got time, I'm wondering about the cultural elements around farming and agriculture and the whole wider discussion around climate change. So as one of my farmers put it to me, these bloody vegans are blaming us for everything. So so what would you say to that? What are there cultural barriers? And if so, how do we tackle that?
I don't think that farming on its own, in terms of and food consumption more generally, it is. I think looking at climate change on its own is probably reductive, and that means that you're not taking into account biodiversity issues both ways. By the way, it doesn't go one way. Trade issues and. I'm going to call it food security, and I don't necessarily only mean food self-sufficiency, although we might come back to that. But also, yes, there are technologies that will improve emissions in the farming industry. There's no one way, and there's no one single silver bullet.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike Reader.
Thank you, Chair. Judicaelle, I'll stick with you. Is it fair to say that climate change is having a major impact on food production in the UK?
Yes, I think you can already say that. I mean, look at the prevalence of flooding in any one year. So we had members who had gone into agreement with the Environment Agency so that their fields would be used as basically floodplains. And that was on the basis of a 1 in 100 flood likelihood. They've been flooded pretty much every year in the last 5.
Given the prevalence of the impact on food security and food production, why don't we see the CLA and the NFU being more prominent in their campaigning on the climate crisis?
I can't answer for other organisations, but we certainly have been responding to every consultation on the subject. We are delighted to be in front of this committee because we have we've made links with DESNES And we want to continue doing that because obviously DEFRA is not the only government department with the levers, and we think that this is a really important thing.
Is it fair to say, therefore, that changes to the taxation on farmers is a much bigger issue than climate change then, given that that was a political issue that drew out the farming community en masse, but we don't see that same level of concern from the farming community about climate?
So I think that taxation is a different matter because there was a very brutal change and one that has an impact which could not have been foreseen and could not have been mitigated. And I think that the changes that we have seen at the last budget will help. In terms of climate change, this has been on the agenda for the CLA for at least a decade. So if, spooling back to 2016, the Brexit vote and what's happened since, we are on the record as favouring a system of public payments for public goods, for example.
Yeah, so it might be a question for you and others on the panel. So is that one of the challenges we face in building support for the energy transition? It's been such an issue for such a long time. People are a bit, blind to it, or they're kind of used to talking about it.
I think actually the awareness has improved over time because of the increasing volatility of the weather, actually.
May I add something? As a member of the North Dorset farming community, people are much more aware because, as Judith says, you go out in your fields, and this January and this month are just as wet as they were last year, and are we then going to see a prolonged drought in the summer and the impact it has, in my instance, in dairy? I think the challenge with the impact of a changing climate and understanding it is a strategic issue, and it's a long-term one, and we live in a very short-term tactical society where our attention is much more immediate, and maybe some of the language that is being used isn't appropriate. So if we were to all write down what we thought we meant by net zero, I suspect we get a variety of views. Similarly, people are talking about 2050. Well, most people's horizons are nowhere near 2050. So it's trying to bring that conversation, that narrative, back to something which is more relevant to the immediacy of today, whether it's in the context of health, whether it's in the context of food security, energy security, or national security, the bits that allow us to enjoy the lifestyle that we do, that I think is where the government needs to put more effort in order to get that traction.
So one of the biggest objections to some of the actions the government will take in addressing energy security in our country, which would be onshore wind, onshore solar, expanding and putting resilience into the transition network. I'd say from my inbox, the biggest argument against all those things is that it impacts on food security. So have we got a mixed message to the public here that food security is important and climate change is massively impacting on food security, but then the public perceive that the actions we're taking to address the impact of climate and energy resilience are actually impacting food security as well? So how do we get that consensus?
Can we just debunk that myth that solar in particular, because it does require land, at least at the moment, is impacting food security? First of all, it only takes 0.1% of all land in the UK at present. Even if we increased it fivefold, as I think the Climate Change Committee recommended, it would still be not very much. And also the what is known as the best and most versatile land, which is what you can think of in terms of producing particularly vegetables and arable, is already protected under the planning system.
Why do you think the public don't recognise that? And I'm sorry that Bradley's left, because it's the big attack on the government is the transition to net zero is impacting on food security. I'm probably sure my colleague Bradley and others from the opposition will make that point time and time again in opposition debates and debates on food security. So why isn't that fact, even if it's coming from an authoritative figure like the CLA, being recognised in the political sphere and in the public?
I think that there is a tendency to try and want to simplify debates, and that probably is part of it. And I think that there is there is an issue certainly that feeds that narrative when you see the scale of some of the energy infrastructure. It looks. First of all, it doesn't look like the landscape that people have grown into. My view sometimes, and I will say that in public, is would you prefer a nuclear power installation? But there are issues around geopolitics and safety, as Neil was already saying, about having very big installations. It is entirely a matter of economics and the grid. So there are things that we can do about it in order to change the narrative.
I think historically power has been generated in the Midlands and the North and transmitted to the South. What we're seeing now is a rollout of renewable power generation across the country. And some people are reacting negatively to that. There is an issue perhaps, and it's to do with economies of scale and for investment, but the size of some of these solar farms are disproportionate to the local demand, and maybe more thought needs to be given towards the concept of microgrids which are joined together. But the reality is that our power generation system is ancient, it's pretty tired, it needs to be replaced. You wouldn't replace it with the same as you had before. We try and move forward with technology, and it's the same with our grid. But that story's got to be told, and I think governments have got to be prepared to tell that story.
Yeah. Sorry. I was just going to. I mean, one follow-up before we move on. We're fairly tight for time today, but this point about solar farms. I mean, I see it in around the country. People are raising this concern about the loss of food-producing land. How much of a problem really is it?
At the moment, it is not a big problem. No. As I said, that food production land is already, the best grade land is already protected under the planning system. So unfortunately, you can only put solar panels where there is enough sunshine, there is a grid connection, and the land is, relatively flat or at least accessible. So it's, you are constrained. And as Neil was saying, it would be much better if that was closer to the centres of population. But sometimes that is just not possible.
No, I mean, we've been told that even if all of the solar that is planned is built, will still be 10 times as much land covered by golf courses as by solar panels.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Build the solar on golf courses.
My colleague just asked, should we be building solar panels on golf courses? You don't necessarily have to answer that question, but I will move on to Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you. We're now coming to climate impacts on workforce health and productivity. And Dr. Romanello, I want to ask you, how exposed is the UK population to climate-related health and productivity risks?
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have very good data that the UK is actually quite vulnerable to climate change. The UK's population is actually quite vulnerable. There's sometimes a generalized belief that the UK is fairly protected from climate change, and that is not true based on the evidence. The UK has a highly vulnerable population, mainly because it has a population that is rapidly aging and also that has a very high burden of non-communicable diseases that increases the vulnerability to climate-based impacts, including heat exposure, which is rapidly growing in the UK. In terms of labor capacity and labor productivity, we know that heat exposure limits people's capacity to work, and this will particularly affect those sectors of work in which workers are highly exposed to the elements. That includes the agricultural sector, that includes the construction sector, with the construction sector bearing disproportionately the burden of the labor capacity lost associated with heat exposure in the UK being a very important sector for the UK's economy. So to give you some numbers that we have produced through an analysis from the Lancet Countdown, we estimate that in 2024 in the UK we lost about 5.16 million labor hour potentials being lost, which is about a 71% increase from the 90s. And this is because of heat exposure directly on a population that is increasing, a worker population is increasing, but mostly because of the higher exposure to temperatures that physiologically restrict labor capacity and labor safety hours. That, in monetary terms, would come associated with about 103 million US dollar equivalents in 2024 lost. That's in dollars for a global comparison. And as I said, kind of over 70% of these losses will be borne by the construction sector, the agricultural sector also being disproportionately affected. What we're seeing is an increased number of days of heat waves that are particularly harmful for outdoor workers. So I'm talking now about labor productivity loss, but it's important also to note that aside from kind of the labor output, there's a huge health risk to these workers, particularly those that need personal protective equipment in their labor. We also see reductions in labor capacity in the health sector that to us is particularly worrying. We've seen wards having to restrict their supply of care during heat waves because of overwhelmed demand, but also because of reduced labor capacity because of absenteeism from healthcare workers during heat waves. And we're seeing a rapid increase in these days of heat waves that will increasingly put pressure on our workers, agricultural and health workers and construction workers and any other exposed sector. To give you a sense of what that looks like, we estimate that 88% of the days of heat wave exposure that people on average were exposed to in 2024 were caused by human-induced climate change. So 88% of those almost 7 days of average days of heat wave exposure per person would not have occurred if it were not for climate change. And the worrying thing is that these extremes of heat are expected to keep on increasing. We're already committed to rising temperatures here in the UK, and we're expecting to see much more exposure to heat waves, with those days of over 40 degrees now about 20 times more likely than in the 60s, and about a 50-50 chance of exceeding that 40-degree threshold again, which I should remind everyone in 2022 led to wards being closed across the country because of the overwhelming healthcare demand and because of labor absenteeism in the healthcare sector.
You're mentioning already sectors and groups that are particularly exposed. What about regions, or is your data not specific about that?
Yeah, so we do have data of kind of exposure and vulnerability to heat across the UK. Obviously, the parts of the UK that are most exposed to health-threatening temperatures are in the south of the UK, mostly in England, in the south of England, the southeast of England being particularly vulnerable also because it has an older population and a higher intrinsic vulnerability. We do see that mortality during extremes of heat is particularly acute in that part of the country. So far, kind of Scotland, Northern Ireland, even Wales are still not as affected as England. The vast majority of the deaths are still occurring in England, and UKHSA estimates, I think it's over the past years, an average of over 2,000 excess deaths during heatwave days in England alone. So the vast majority of the heat-related mortality in the UK is borne by England.
And should there be some specific health metrics that the government or the NHS should publish and should become mandatory in order to actually sort of highlight the risks?
Well, I certainly think so. It's worth noting there has been a lot of advances in terms of starting to measure these health impacts. The UKHSA now regularly monitors excess death during days of heatwave and publishes that data. We have less accurate evidence on other types of health impacts from climate change, namely the change in kind of climate-related morbidity. So demand for healthcare is much less consistently reported. We also have less reports of other types of adverse health impacts, or at least reports in relation to climate drivers, like, for example, from respiratory acute illness or from chronic lack of access to essential healthcare during heat waves, or even to infectious disease surveillance, which is increasing in the UK, and we definitely need to build more awareness to the population on where those risks are emerging or established for the population to take better action. And I would say there's plenty of studies that have been done in terms of how aware the population is of their risks and how well this is being communicated by the government. And what we see consistently through surveys is that people generally understand that climate change poses risks, but by and large, people don't self-identify as vulnerable, which means that while they do acknowledge there are risks from heat exposure, they think that those risks are borne by someone else and not by themselves, which means that while the government might put forward heat and health alerts, for example, people are not being able to respond to them effectively because they don't self-identify as those people who should be taking action to those alerts. So I think there's a lot that we should be doing in terms of building awareness and better communicating, better informing the public about the threats that they're actually facing and better empowering that action.
And should the government be more proactive to actually linking it to climate change rather than sort of saying there's a heat wave and please do something? And obviously we need to protect people's health, but is there a political message also in in there to sort of say, well, and if we don't do anything about climate change, then these risks increase. Should the government be more proactive about it? Should the NHS and other public institutions more proactive about linking these health risks to climate change?
I absolutely think so, and it's for two reasons. First, because the public deserve honest information from the government. The public need to be told frankly what the risks are, and climate change is an existential risk to many people. So they need to be aware of the threats we're facing, and they need to know that those health harms that they are facing, that their family members are facing, are due to climate change that is human-induced and that we need to respond to. So from the point of view of being truthful in terms of how the government is communicating, I think there's an absolute kind of responsibility from the government to communicate better. But on the other hand, we also have really good studies, including by Michiel de Sandy, that has led some of these studies here in the UK, about the importance of building awareness to the public of the links between climate change and health, because that makes climate change personal, because it's under self-interest to gain awareness of those threats. And there's studies that show that when people are instructed or when we communicate the health dimensions of climate change, people are much more likely to support climate action, to want to take action, and to take climate change more seriously. Even when we there's some studies in the US on more kind of climate skeptic parts of the community, that they're much more likely to engage with and support mitigation action when they understand the co-benefits to health, how beneficial it would be in terms of reducing the health risks, but also of delivering health co-benefits in the form of healthier air or healthier diets or more sustainable agricultural systems. So there is enough evidence to understand that the public need to be able to make these links, to be able to know how to respond and respond on their own self-interest a lot better than they are.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you want to, as we've started talking about health co-benefits, do you want to carry on with the second set of questions you have?
I have, I think, already sort of done that, because it's should the government, the NHS, other public institutions? Yeah.
Okay, fine. Lizzie.
Thanks. So I just wanted to pick up something you said about people not thinking that heat risks apply to them. We know that you can mitigate some of the health impacts of heat through behavioural change. Do you think that in the UK people know how to change their behaviour or environment, and are they doing it?
I think there's more awareness now. And again, we are seeing that with the UK HSA heat and health alerts, awareness has increased and behaviour has changed. The UK HSA has done evaluation of the heat and health alerts, and they have seen that the expected mortality decreased after that alert was established. However, what we're also seeing is that there's
I'm sorry, is that because of the impact on services and how they behave, or on individuals?
On everything. It has to have to do with individuals as well. Because with heat impacts, there's a lot that has to do with the attitudes towards seeking care. Being able to identify risks is very important for healthcare seeking behavior. And being able to protect yourself is what will reduce the burden of disease and mortality across the UK in a population large scale. So there's definitely more awareness there. There's still evidence that we're not effectively reaching the most vulnerable communities, from surveys that have been rolled out. And there's also evidence that there's loss of effectiveness of the heat alert once it's been repeatedly put out. And you see that reduction in the effectiveness over time. It's unclear why that is, if it's that people respond to the first alert but then kind of lose awareness of the risk or think it's not such a big deal as they thought so at the beginning. But there is something to be done there about accurately communicating the extent of the risk and being much more targeted about who needs to respond and how, to make sure that people can self-identify properly, because that's a big, big problem that we're facing. There's also been some studies in the healthcare sector that shows that even the healthcare sector is not adequately responding to those heat and health alerts, because sometimes they're issued, but the response measures are not entirely clear.
Have I got time to ask about NHS communication?
Yes, you have.
So we've heard other evidence that says that messages about climate change come best from people who are already trusted. Given that the level of trust in the NHS is very high, do you think it would be wise to use the NHS to roll out messages not just about health, but climate change that is causing that health damage?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we have to use the NHS for that purpose. I think the NHS has a responsibility to, again, communicate effectively and accurately the health threats that people are facing. And those health threats are coming from climate change and will continue to grow because of climate change. And I think there is where the NHS has a huge responsibility in being able to first raise the alarm on what are the threats that the NHS itself in their provision of service will continue to face, but also in the community and how our whole epidemiological profile will change because of climate change. And secondly, the NHS is the front line, the first line of defense to the health threats of climate change, is the one that will bear the burden of disease increasing with climate change, that has to increase the healthcare provision and change their healthcare delivery pathways also as a result of climate change. So the NHS has to adapt much faster to climate change. They now have an adaptation plan that is evolving in place, but we do need to ensure that the NHS is strong enough, and that requires political and public support as well.
Thank you, Chair.
And just one last question. Could you sort of spell out the most notable health co-benefits of transitioning to low-carbon technologies? Just, in a...
Real numbers. So, in the UK, we estimate about 28,000 premature deaths coming from human sources, 55% of which come from fossil fuel burning. So you could avoid them directly by phasing out fossil fuels. It's talking about thousands of deaths of the most vulnerable parts of the population. The transport sector being the biggest single contributor, with about 10,000 deaths from road transport. We know how to reduce those deaths. Those disproportionately affect urban populations.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Lizzie, do you have any more questions on the impact of climate change on the NHS?
I think the witness covered the impact not just on people, but also on the systems of the NHS quite clearly in earlier answers. But just to be clear, we talked about kind of the impact on ward closures and things like that, so increased demand. But are there any other system impacts of climate change on the NHS that would then impact their ability to provide care, whether that's infrastructure or whatever? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, flooding, clear example. We've also seen disruption of services due to floods, and the supply chain is also of concern, particularly because we have a very vulnerable supply chain. It's a global supply chain, so something that we do need to take a lot into account.
And what about some of the research we saw talked about IT failures as well?
Yeah, we had IT failures.
Systems to cope?
So the whole of the NHS state is at risk from climate change. It's a very frail state. In general, it's an old state. So you have, I think, I don't remember the number, but there's a high percentage of the NHS estate that is at risk of heat stress, and that is not being addressed currently. You need to retrofit that estate to make sure that the wards are still safe for the patients living within them. Heat stress delays also discharge of patients, so it increases from the inside and from the outside that pressure on healthcare provision. We have heard from nurses, 90% of nurses thought that they had occupational heat strain that impaired their performance, and 20% reported heat-related absenteeism already in a regular year. So we are already seeing those stresses. I should also say we shouldn't forget about social care. And social care is perhaps much more difficult to tackle because it's decentralized and through private sector providers largely. And also during 2022, we saw a huge number of deaths of elderly populations within care homes. And the reason for that is that the care homes did not realize how vulnerable the UK is to overheating. So there's a lot to do there in terms of working with the private sector as well, and public-private partnerships in terms of advancing care for those patients.
Can I just add something, Chair? If you look at all the risks to our prosperity and well-being, some of them fall into the traditional box, state-on-state conflict, non-state actors fighting states and this sort of thing. Others sit in a more transboundary, transnational pandemics, organised crime, etc. The challenge with climate change is it permeates everything at once. And if we're going to actually, if governments are going to address it, the North Cotterellian model of government isn't the right one. In the sense that this stovepipe approach to things, we've got to at least push them on their side, if not go much more horizontal. And we've got to bring in whole of society, because whole of society has responsibilities as well. It can't be just government that government can set the conditions and framework, but society has a role to play in all of this. And I think until we can get a narrative that says actually this is all our responsibility and it's not going to go away, we're not going to actually make the progress to address many of the issues, whether it's infrastructure, which is the same for defence, it's the same for other sectors as well, will not be addressed in the most joined up, most cost-effective fashion to deliver the results we're looking for.
Yeah, I mean that's very interesting. I mean, the government has, it had this mission approach on climate and on a number of other matters as well. We don't hear so much about that these days, I guess. Is that the sort of thing you're thinking about?
Yes, I mean I think you've got to bring all the actors together, and then you start to understand those co-benefits. If you remove fossil fuels from the transport sector, air quality improves, fewer premature births, fewer deaths from respiratory issues, more money to be spent on health in other issues which are apparent and that sort of thing.
So your point is that it's about communicating the co-benefits as widely.
It's got to be in the language that's understood in the pub or the equivalent. Because if it's not, it doesn't go anywhere.
You both indicated, so I think you went first. So.
Thank you. Just to say, it is really important that we don't forget that actually an awful lot of the conversation is happening now on social media. And that unfortunately very few people will be reading the whole of your research. They'll be looking for a tidbit. How does the government, including parliamentarians, deal with that? I think that's way above my pay grade, but we are thinking about that as an organisation. And the other
what's the CLA doing to improve the use of social media? We might find it quite useful.
We are on social media, and last time that there was a big I can't remember what exactly prompted it, but there was a discussion about solar panels on farmland, and we were out there saying, no, this is not a problem. We really do need solar panels for transition. We also need them. They've got co-benefits in terms of viability of farming because they provide an alternative source of income. But in terms of providing the data, which has to come from government, the NHS, and people who are trusted, it really is important that seeps into social media as well. And I had another point, but I can't remember it. So.
I mean, to that point, again, we have studies that show that people engage a lot better with the actions needed to tackle climate change when they understand what's there to gain for them and what are the kind of co-benefits in terms of better employment, better health determinants, etc. And to give you a bit of a sense of that, going back to a discussion about the agricultural sector, in the UK, about 30% of the agricultural-related greenhouse gas emissions come from red meat and dairy production. And the excess consumption of red meat and dairy is also associated with 50,000 excess deaths every year, roughly. We eat generally really unhealthily, and moving towards healthier diets could bring huge co-benefits in terms of mitigating emissions, also from healthier agricultural sector production, which does not mean we should all go vegan tomorrow. It means that we need to start eating healthier and have healthier food systems as well. And the other thing I wanted to note, also going back to the issue of the NHS and integration of these threats, the greener NHS and the NHS commitments from net zero marked a really important milestone, and they came from that kind of responsibility of the NHS of ensuring that we reduce the threats to people's health, to people's well-being from climate change as well. And I think that should be celebrated as a huge achievement of the UK.
We won't go into ultra-processed foods and how really, really bad they are for you, but...
there you go.
That's discussion about this.
Brown bread and baked beans.
It's not quite as simple as
that. That's sparked something. I'm not quite sure. Neil, I'm going to come back to you about defence matters.
Salt, sugar and fat.
How much are climate driven changes, water scarcity, resource competition? How much are they affecting future conflict and security predictions?
The impact of a changing climate has security implications. I touched on the sort of different natures of conflicts that we see it today, and the fact that climate change cuts across. If you look at where it's had its greatest effect so far, I mean, it is a global issue, but the equatorial belt, you see far more impact than elsewhere. Frequently in countries that don't necessarily have the resilience and capacity to look after their citizens, they've suffered food shortages or food issues, health issues, demographic issues and challenges. And in those parts of the world, people are faced with two choices. One, you move. Most people don't want to move. The vast majority move within their country, but may move from rural to urban areas because of the results of failed harvests, prolonged failed harvests, etc., which would exacerbate existing tensions. I think the UNDP says about 10 to 15% move beyond the boundary. And we've seen, as we saw in 2015, when there was a movement of population from Syria as a result of a drought, which had the impact it has in European politics and its destabilising effect. But others can't move, and then they are susceptible to being recruited by the likes of Boko Haram, AQ, Al-Shabaab and others, and we see increased instability and tension in those parts of the world. As I mentioned earlier on, those parts of the world are where the world's trade routes run as well, and they start to impact on interests. So it becomes a global problem. It is unlikely that there will be, I wouldn't rule it out, but I think it's very unlikely that there will be a war that is a direct result of climate change. But you can see climate change acting as a stress or threat multiplier, or even a catalyst for conflict, because it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, for a better way of putting it.
Okay, and how should we prepare for the consequences of such conflict?
Like any threat, you need a picture. You need to build a picture up of what's going on. So we need to draw on sources, some of which are traditional sources of gaining a picture from within the security community, and I mean it in its widest sense, not just defence, but also from academia and elsewhere. You need to be able to interpret that picture, understand what it's telling you, and determine what the potential threats to UK interests are, or to European interests, or to NATO interests, depending on which community you're thinking about, and then determine where your priorities are for action. The trouble is that quite often things like food security, we look at it from a domestic perspective. Have we got enough food to feed our population, or where are we going to get it if we can't? Actually, we should also be looking at what's happening to grain harvests over here. As a result of weather, is there a drop in a grain harvest? We saw it it goes back 15, 20 years. 2010, Russian heat wave, grain harvest down, less exported. Well, that in itself wouldn't have been a problem, except it was very wet in Canada, it was very wet in Australia, so their harvests were down, price of wheat went up, price of bread went up, and that was one of the catalysts for the Arab Spring. So we need to be looking at all of those factors, as well as those that just on direct UK interests. So you have that picture. And the weaponisation. War in Ukraine stopped grain harvest being exported. What's the consequences of that for global stability?
Can I add on to that from the health perspective? There's good studies that now have started to link climate change, health, and conflict. And that underscores the importance of supporting local communities to reduce that push factor for migration and the drivers of conflict, with climate change being a threat amplifier. The work of FCDO in that sense is hugely important. The work in support of foreign aid is super important to reduce the risk of conflict, to reduce the risk of migration, and to make situations safer abroad. But also in terms of when migration does happen, the risks to local population, both in terms of the migrant population and the homing population of the country of destination, is worth taking care of, because we're having an increased suitability for the transmission of infectious diseases that we are starting to import from abroad, and the UK is becoming more suitable for diseases like dengue. It will eventually become suitable for diseases like malaria. And we need to prepare the NHS, we need to prepare our health system, and we need to be prepared to deal with a migrant population that has a completely different burden of disease and epidemiological profile than the one that we have at home.
There is no security solution to climate change. It's no good deploying a squadron of tanks or something. The answer lies in the soft power element, the aid element and that sort of thing, and building capacity and resilience in those countries so they can cope with the challenges their citizens are facing. And that needs to be factored into the equation as much as the immediate threats.
Just adding to what Marina was saying, I think part of the difficulty that we have with looking at the transition, particularly in terms of energy, is that in a way we're not looking wide enough. So, for example, food storage, and I don't know whether you've had evidence from Professor Tim Lang, but he's done a recent report for government on food security and resilience, which talked about what would the population do and the government do and the food supply chain more widely do if there were several different risks eventuating at the same time. Really important. And the second thing is in terms of diseases, it doesn't stop at human diseases. We've got exactly the same sorts of risks in agriculture in terms of pests and diseases moving where the climate is moving. So I think monitoring and surveillance and preparing is also important from that perspective.
Thanks very much. Graham Downey.
Thank you very much, Chair. Professor Morisetti, in your introduction as well, in your answer to the Chair's first question, you talked about Russia attacking Ukraine energy infrastructure as a weak point. We've seen the UK signing up to the Hammond Declaration in January, which covers any range of energy security issues, but is a sign of international cooperation. Where do you think the priorities should be inside the Hammond Declaration for where we should focus that collaboration with allies around that North Sea coast, essentially, you could probably say?
I mean, I think there's a physical piece in the sense of that 100 gigawatts of talking about wind power, principally wind power. We might want to look at other areas of technology. I mean, tidal wave, particularly tidal, the wind may or may not blow, the sun may or may not shine, but the tide comes in and out twice a day. That's a certainty. So that sort of thing. So the technological advances together. There is also the piece, I think, of a willingness to share power. Because one of the things from the Hamburg Agreement is that through interconnectors, this offshore wind farm can supply more than one nation, is an understanding that we are better off working together to meet power, which has been done for donkey's years. I mean, we've been sharing power with the French depending on priorities and demands and timings for many years. That collaborative approach, which is going to be challenging, because at the end of the day, energy security is national security. And few nations are going to abdicate the responsibility for that, because the chances are the government will find themselves out of office pretty quickly. If
Just on that point of interconnectors and renewables, this came up in a previous evidence session as well, that the challenge is if it's sunny in the southeast of England, the odds are it's sunny in the northwest of France as well. And at what point does they say, well, we can't share because we've actually got our own as well? So that where's that balance? But thinking about that in terms of that kind of North Sea.
Well, there is a scope in the sense of it may be sunny in the south of England, it may not be in Scandinavia, and vice versa. But also, I think we need to look for storage, because at the end of the day, you're never going to get across over the real challenge if you haven't got that storage capacity as well. For the power that can't be used. And again, once you start to store it and then use it later, you start to perhaps counter the narrative, which is we had to turn the turbines off and pay everyone lots of money, which comes as a negative one for renewable energy.
And just in terms of the more physical and cybersecurity elements that are covered in the Hamburg Declaration as well, where do you see the line for them? How close should that cooperation be? I mean, we've got something like the Joint Expeditionary Force that covers, physical security in the High North. Is it almost you're asking for a physical security force or cyber security force that protects North Sea assets, particularly if you're talking about more collaboration in terms of generation? I think
there has to be, it's unlikely one nation's going to do it on its own. There has to be some form of agreement. We recognise that this is vulnerable to cyber. Grids in particular are vulnerable, and that we will have to work together. But it's in all our interest to do so, because we all need this power at some point.
I think final question, just to pick up on what I was speaking to someone in Scotland quite recently involved in energy generation in the north east offshore, and they said, if a Russian submarine appears next to my installation, who do I phone?
And the answer is you need some grey surface vessels around to distract that and make sure that Russian doesn't pop up by your...
And can you see in a conflict, in an increasingly fractured world, can you see something, not the Hamburg Declaration, I'm not suggesting that, but some kind of security force and collaboration coming out of that is cyber, that is physical, that is...
Whether it's physical or cyber, we can sign up to all these agreements. We've got to deliver on those agreements. We've got to build the wind farms. We've then got to generate that power. There needs to be effective deterrents to stop that Russian submarine appearing. So you need kit, and you need people who are trained to use that kit, and you're prepared to forward deploy that kit, whether it's a Norwegian ship, a British warship, French one, or whatever, in order that we are deterring activity by potential adversaries.
That's done quite informally at the moment, or done between militaries at the moment.
It's done between militaries, but most European militaries are too small. If I cast my mind back to my youth, when there were 30, 40 ships in the Fishery Protection Squadron out there in the North Sea.
So you'd say there'd be merit in a more formalising of that kind of arrangement as part of energy security in the most physical sense?
In its widest sense. So NATO, or whatever you want grouping it is, should have that sort of formal agreement, yes.
How quickly should we be expanding our military?
Personal view, we're at war already. It's a warm war. We need to have effective deterrence. We need to have the ability to demonstrate presence. And whilst today's warships, today's tanks, today's aircraft are much more capable than their predecessors, you can only be in one place at one time. And therefore, I do think we need to expand our military. Yes.
Is the government going fast enough?
No. That's personal view. Lots of noise, but part of it is, and in a sense it's what all this discussion is about narrative. If you haven't got the right narrative to explain to the public, and it's very hard if the public can see the food in the supermarkets, the petrol in the petrol stations, they can go on holiday, etc. What's the threat?
Chair, if I can just jump in very briefly, one of my pet projects.
Sorry, I'm on my bandwagon.
I'll be joining you on it in a second. And is that when we're telling narrative around the threats that are caused or precipitative of climate change, rather than just describing a climate change narrative in the same way that we describe why is renewable energy important? Because it brings your bills down. Is an element of in the communications and the narrative stepping back from talking about climate change and saying this is about security.
This is about national security, which in my book is prosperity and well-being, the things that allow us to do what we want to do. And all of those are at risk today, and there are various actions we have to take to mitigate and reduce those risks. Some of them are in the health world, some are in the land and farming world, but there's also a piece in the hard power.
And there's a risk if we don't tackle this that food prices increase, partly as a precipitative to climate change, health crisis increase precipitative to climate change because we have not deterred effectively and told that story.
Yeah, and everyone says, well, don't worry, it's all in the docks in Rotterdam. But hang on, that's been said in French, German, Dutch and everything else, because we're all trying to get the same.
Thank you, Chair.
Right, Rita.
I'll just pick up and then I'll go on to talking back about renewables. Would a stronger link in the current government narrative between defence and the need for an energy transition help build better consensus for the investment that we need to make in our energy sector?
I think it needs to be a link in the sense of security and resilience. And we need to define security, which includes defence, but it's not just defence, as you follow.
Thank you. Judicaelle, if I can come to you. We've got data from DEFRA that shows around a third of farmers have had uptake of renewables. Almost all of that is solar, and most farmers aren't exploring wind, biodigestion, anaerobic digestion, etc. Why do you think that is?
So, first of all, for wind, until fairly recently there was a ban on onshore wind, and of course that means that the project basically stopped dead. So we are now seeing an industry coming back to life on that one. Solar, I think the price of the technology has gone down massively. So it is a well-established technology. It is becoming more and more affordable. It is fairly easy to set up. And it can be taken out as well. So that's the other point that I forgot to mention last time. You put solar panel on the field, you can take them off again. And indeed you can graze in between. So you could even do that. So that I think is why we have seen the uptake that we have in solar versus others. But I should say I have members in Yorkshire who remind me of hydro as well, which we don't talk nearly enough. And in Scotland, exactly. So even more so. So yes.
I mean, there are direct incentives for installing solar from DEFRA. Those don't exist for some of those other technologies. Do you think government could do more to incentivise those other technologies beyond just solar?
Probably, although, and I'm going to remain quite general, I think there was an issue with solar where basically subsidies made things more expensive rather than less expensive. And I would not want to push for something that has the same impact. I think straight subsidies always have a negative impact on markets. Maybe things like soft loans would be a better bet at zero or very low interest rate, or something like government being supplier of last resort, etc. I think that there is something about better coordination of projects, because as I said before, the problem is solar panels, unless you've got a very small array, you need either a battery array to take the energy when it's not being used, or you need a good connection to the grid and then a good transmission grid to take it elsewhere. I think that is an issue that needs to be addressed. It can absolutely be addressed, but at the moment we've got members who are caught in the crossfire of that infrastructure.
Did this form part of your evidence into the Batters review, I guess? Was this, that was like a profitability and a large argument for installing renewables beyond the green thing is that you can reduce your costs. So do you think in the Batters review it was clear enough on the profitability benefits of investing in green technology?
We've got members who've managed to manage the energy cost with solar panels and batteries, particularly when they have commercial properties that they let out to other businesses. So we've got members in Bedfordshire who have a small solar array that basically powers 20 or so businesses that operate on their site, including a brewery. So it is doable. There are issues, however, if you're looking at decarbonising half a village or a street in the countryside, about you having to become a licensed energy provider. And we would love the government to have a look at simplifying that, because it is stopping investment in decarbonisation.
You picked up my final question around sort of what are the technical, financial or policy barriers that prevent farms from exploring renewables and I guess as well explore renewables beyond solar. It sounds like licensing is one of them.
So planning is still an issue, and what we are finding is some local authorities are first of all faster and secondly more likely to be sympathetic than others. It does depend on what the community thinks is in it for them. And again, the government has recently consulted on that in terms of reduced bills being the primary lever. I think that there are other things that the government probably ought to be thinking about, for example, in terms of improvement in local grids, and I mean really local. So, for example, can the whole street in a local area run heat pumps and have an electric vehicle and solar panels on their roofs? There are places where if you try and do that, the copper will melt. And it seems to me that would be a really good way of bolstering the community's resilience.
Just add, so I think you've talking to a local farmer recently about this issue about the barriers. I think you've already covered planning, access to the grid and costs. He also mentioned access to advice, and specifically on anaerobic digesters, suggested that they aren't suitable for the vast majority of farmers and it is more complex than most people realise. I wonder if you want to comment on that.
I'm not sure I can, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm sure that there are areas where you wouldn't want an anaerobic digester because what you have to feed it is not enough, or you have to transport it for too far. And indeed, that's part of the problem that we're having with using animal waste at the moment. They're produced by and large in the west of the country, and actually they're needed in the east where you've got the big cereals. So it's the same for anaerobic digester in the sense that the digestate probably needs to be moved around. I think the problem is likely to be the feedstock and where that comes from.
And on the broader question of advice?
There are plenty of advisors, so I would love to pick that up. And if they are CLA members, of course, they can always come to us for free. It's part of their membership.
Thank you. Final question from Lizzie.
Thanks. On anaerobic digesters, Do the same barriers that you talked about apply when they are for generating electricity on site? Because those are the ones that I've looked at most, and the idea was supposed to be that it used waste from that farm or from a few farms locally and generate electricity. And the government responded to a written question that I put in about this, saying that there was no specific funding schemes for anaerobic digester sites that generate electricity. I was wondering if you had any comments on those two things about the technology and also the funding of the capital costs.
All I will say about the technology, because that's not my area of expertise, is I'm aware that they vary. And so what might work for a particular kind of farm might not work for another. And again, it depends. If you're producing electricity, are you using all of it, or do you have a grid access? And in terms of funding, yes, it would be great to have more, but then again, there are financial pressures, and we're well aware that the government needs to make decisions about priorities. So, always useful. My question would be, in the big picture, where does that fit? Because that's something else.
Where do you think it fits?
Sorry?
Where do you think it fits?
So I think it needs to be part of the general thinking that the government is doing about energy and spatial thinking. So are there areas where it is more difficult to have other types of renewable, where AD actually would be a great thing? Are there specific clusters where that energy could be used? So you not just have a farm, you also have heated glass houses, for example, or you have a food processing or a food manufacturer or something else that uses it. So there needs to be more thinking at national level, but also at local level, with the new mayors and the combined authorities, about where's the need, where's the demand, and therefore where is the market failing?
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate your evidence. Very, very, very good witnesses, all three of you, so thank you. There are undoubtedly things where you'd like to add. I think Judicaelle, you've already said you're going to follow up. If all three of you have things you want to follow up, that's always very helpful for us in gathering our evidence, so please do so. We will suspend the session while we change over witness. Order. Welcome back to this afternoon's session of the Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee, building support for the energy transition. Our last session on this topic, and we are now taking evidence from the department. Minister, you are very welcome. Ryan, perhaps if you can just introduce yourself as well, and then we will start with the questions.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Ryan McLaughlin. I'm the Director for Net Zero Strategy in the department.
And Minister, do you want to just tell us your departmental responsibilities?
For sure. I am the Minister for Climate Action since September. Responsible for net zero strategy, for the carbon budgets, for green finance, and for international climate change.
Splendid. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We just had an excellent first panel who have set you, I'll phrase this the right way, who have set the scene very nicely, I think is a better way of putting it. We've gathered a lot of evidence on this. It is an absolutely crucial element of the government's approach to the energy transition. Without taking people with us, it's going to be very, very difficult. Indeed, Minister, you said our clean energy mission will only succeed if we take people with us. How well do you think you are doing in taking people with us?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. So I think, actually, if we look at the statistics, actually the polling numbers are surprisingly, and I say this as a Member of Parliament because I think sometimes the perception is different, but the polling numbers are incredibly high in terms of the British public supporting taking action on climate change. We do regular assessments, but 79% of the public support taking action on tackling climate change. I think sometimes it can feel in this place like it's not entirely reflective of that, but actually, as I say, it is still a top issue amongst the public. I think all of us can notice, however, that the political consensus that we have enjoyed over the last 20 years has come under strain, and some of the reporting has become more negative around some areas of this agenda. And so I think we need to be, and I am, mindful, aware of what is happening out there. I think what the department has been doing, and I pay tribute to my predecessor, Kerry McCarthy, but what the department's been doing since we came into office has been some really good work. We started off with the Secretary of State laying out an excellent plan for our clean energy mission, and for me, communications, the best communications follows a really good strategy, and we have an excellent strategy and excellent plan. We've been doing some really great communications. As I've come into the department, I've been involved with the Net Zero Council. We've launched our public participation plan. Is there more to do? Absolutely. And I'm really keen to work with colleagues and with the department to make sure we build on that.
Well, thank you, Minister, for your opening answer, and we will explore the elements of what you just said in the next hour. We heard from Luke Trill, and this is to your department's credit, that DESNZ is the most effective department at communicating what the government is doing. However, we also heard from Luke Trill and from others in the same session that whilst people, and you quite rightly quote the very high figures of support for the transition, or support for action on climate, perhaps more accurately, when people are asked whether they are prepared to pay for it, or when people are asked if they think they will pay for it, attitudes change quite markedly. What is your answer to the challenge that people say they're not keen to pay if it's going to cost them to take part in addressing climate change?
So I think if what you're saying, Mr. Chairman, is that people want to tackle climate change and at the same time they want to reduce their cost of living, I completely agree with you. And people want both of those things. And what we need to do as a government is to meet both of those needs. And we need to make sure that we are leading the transition to a low carbon Britain at the same time as reducing our energy bills, which we know is one of the biggest issues for people up and down the country. And so on that, I think we have to explain what we are doing, why we are doing it. And for me, that means outlining what the risks are of inaction, what's happening now within our country, what are the opportunities about that shift, and as well, what other benefits will come, whether it's to communities, whether it's around health benefits. I think you've just been talking to experts on this, whether it's around nature restoration benefits. We need to make sure we are explaining all of the reasons for why we are doing this and what it is. I'll just say a couple more things. I think we need to do a better job of explaining the shift in the energy system. We have been a purchaser of energy in a way that we are buying energy off other countries at large. We have been taking commodities. It's a bit like renting a house. We are shifting to a system now where we are almost purchasing our own house. It's almost a down payment on a future house. And once we have got that up and running, we will be able to reap more of the benefits. So I think we need to explain to the public that we are shifting our energy system and there is a down payment on that. And I'd just like to reflect that some people say, well, what are the choices in front of us? The choices in front of us are we do nothing, in which case we have a decaying grid that won't take advantage of the industrial opportunities. We set up an energy system for renewables, clean energy system, or we set up a fossil fuel-based system. I think those are the three options. And we are choosing to go for the clean energy system for multiple reasons, for tackling climate change, but also because it's about British sovereignty, and we want to make sure that Britain is energy secure in the future. So it's around making sure we do those things.
Sorry to interrupt you.
For sure.
Do you think people have understood that that's what you're trying to do?
I think there's more to do, absolutely, in terms of making that clear, and we need to. And I'm sure.
Okay,
yes.
You said that before. What are you going to do differently to get that message across?
So I think so first of all, let's go in terms of what are the risks and what is happening within our country at the moment. I think you've just been speaking to Neil Morisetti, talking about what are the risks and what is happening within our country at the moment. We're looking, colleagues have been flooded. What is the impact of that? And so making sure that people are aware of why we are taking action. Now, we are doing some of that ourselves, but as you'll know well, MPs are, and government is not, sadly, the most trusted source of news. So we need to work with others in order to get that messaging out, whether it's around...
Who do you think should carry the message better?
I think it's multiple message carriers, and I'm working with multiple message carriers. One of them is, we work with the Net Zero Council, which was relaunched under the Secretary of State, a great selection of individuals from trade union leaders to corporate leaders, leaders of NGOs are all within that, and I think each of them has a role to play in carrying that message. It's a huge opportunity, is this, but it's also a very complex message, and we need to make sure that we're using the right messengers with the right message to meet the right audience.
We can expect to hear from all of those different leaders making this case.
Absolutely.
Good. One final question from me before I move on to the rest of the committee. The electricity price has been the top issue raised with us, and I'm sure it's the top issue raised with you. Given the investment that you've just outlined, those three choices, how are you going to bring the electricity price down? How are you going to close the spark gap at the same time? The budget has given made a start on this, but the feedback is that it's by nowhere near enough to ensure people take advantage of the Warm Homes Plan, for example. What is available to you to do this in the short term? Because building out the renewable system is a multi-year project.
Absolutely. Okay, so as you referred to some of the interventions we've already made, we have doubled the Warm Homes discount, so it's now available to 6 million people over this winter. We will be taking, as you rightly mentioned, £150 off energy costs, thanks to the announcements in the budget. And obviously we had the Warm Homes Plan coming out last week, looking at that investment across the board. So I think we have already started to make those strays. We are working across the board to see how we can look at areas to reduce. But as you know, Ms. Chairman, we need to decouple ourselves from the international fossil fuel market. But we are looking, we understand that energy costs are the biggest issue for consumers up and down the country, and we need to make sure that we are listening and doing everything we can to meet that need. As I say, we've made significant interventions with the Warm Homes Plan, a £15 billion investment and upgrades, £150 off.
You just mentioned decoupling there. Is that going to happen?
We're looking at all options. Don't get me in trouble.
Just really repeating back to you, Minister, what you have said, but we will perhaps pursue that with the Secretary of State next week. Graham Downey.
Thank you very much. Chair, you mentioned in your introduction the importance of effective communications. Mm-hmm. What do you think the public think that net zero means?
That's a great question. I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure for most people, most members of the public know what net zero means. I don't think that most people know. I think it's become it's a term that has in some ways become weaponised, but it's a policy term that is used as part of a long-term direction. Is it a useful term? I mean, it's something we've done to set the long-term trajectory, but actually what I'm worried about on day-to-day is how we meet our carbon budgets, how we move towards that, the transition, how we make sure we're bringing communities with us. I think it's very much narrowed the debate in this place, whereas actually what I'm interested in is widening that debate again, which for those of us who've been around this agenda for 20 years, very much around the risks and why we're doing this, whether it's around the Aviva reports on subsidence within our homes, whether it's around flooding, whether it's around the lack of resilience within some of our systems, and the transition and the opportunities. So I spend very little amount of my time on that one term. It's useful in some contexts, but for the general public, less so.
Just when you're describing some of the good actions that you're taking there, those net zero was kind of through a lot of the things you were describing. If we want the public to engage with this agenda, and I think you were right to point out that the motivation of individuals or businesses is around costs, would it not be more helpful to use phraseology in terms that directly relate to the department and indeed the initiative's purpose and outcome, rather than that kind of policy term?
I think what you're saying to me is that if the language should be more appropriate and more accessible, 100%. I think language is very inaccessible in this debate, and we have terms that people do not know what it means. So yeah.
What might be better terms to use, and does the Secretary of State need a new title?
I think, for me, I want to have a cleaner, greener, healthier, wealthier country, and I think this is the route to doing it. So any of those words, whether it's a cleaner home, a healthier home, a cleaner environment, a greener environment, any of those words are more the words that I think you and I would use around a dinner table. I certainly don't have a conversation around anything else. So there's so many exciting things happening in this area. I kind of think this is somewhat a false debate, and there's so many things that I want to do, and I know the Secretary of State is leading us to do brilliant things. That's what we're spending our time on.
I think perhaps to Ryan as well, related to that point, is there something from a civil service point of view where those kind of policy languages, that kind of policy language that of course is the right scientific term to use, how do we make sure that the department does not reflect that in some of the public communications, that kind of language is kept for scientific or internal discussion?
Yeah, it's a really great point. As the Minister said, the net zero term has been helpful in setting legal targets and international agreements, but it doesn't speak to the heart of the public. What we've done over the past year is through our carbon budget plan, which is a very technical document, we put a topper document, Unlocking the Benefits of the Green Transition, which talked about the co-benefits of how it actually impacts people's lives. And then in December, the Minister published Energising Britain, which was our public participation plan to set out how we would engage. I'd say that the communications campaigns that the department's run doesn't mention net zero. That doesn't speak to people. We've focused much more on the individual actions that people take, whether that's through our Warm and Fuzzy campaign at a national level, right down to sort of the micro targeting that we do through our TikTok and other social media campaigns. So we do make an active decision not to use words that switch people off.
I think just finally, Chairman, we're slightly probably over time. You mentioned in your introduction that 79% of people support action on climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any data further to that on what their motivation was for supporting action on climate? Was it saving the planet? Was it lower bills? Was it jobs? Was it investment? Because I believe the statistic, it sounds right, but I think the motivation matters almost more than a quick answer to a polling company saying we support this, because it's almost hard to not support it.
Yeah, I'm trying to make sure, and so Ryan, back at me, check if I get any of the things. So in terms of, I think there's multiple motivations. I think, as you say, there is a vast majority of the public understand it's happening, and not just because people have been talking about it for 20 years, but because they see it themselves, whether it's around, an influx of ladybirds or wasps over the summer. People can see things feel different. So, they've seen the flooding. We've now had extreme heat waves happen in the UK. We've seen wildfires happening in Scotland, also in, San Francisco. So I think the people are... So
the motivation for people, or the key motivation really is to stop the increase of forest fires, increase the risk, just reduce the risk of flooding. Again, it's just because a lot of that would come back to how the department communicates.
Yeah, and I think people have got different motivations. So I think it's around. Sorry, I was trying to make the point. I think people understand it is an issue and want to act on that issue because they can see the trajectory and where it is heading to. There is a lot of concern around, as well, energy security, sovereignty, and thirdly around children and grandchildren. I think, people are motivated that they want to leave a better legacy for their children and grandchildren. And so that is one of the motivators. So we look at all of these different elements, whilst at the same time, as the Chair said, making sure that we are meeting the needs of today, which is reducing energy bills.
Just finally, should we just change the name of the department as well from NETS? Would you like to change that?
No, I don't. Of the list of things that I want to do, it's nowhere near my list of priorities because, frankly, it would just take a lot of time and money, and I'd rather do that spending on talking to people around a table in a normal way and trying to communicate in different ways. There's so many great things the department are doing. They did a campaign with Big John of the Sun, that they're doing, which is meeting people, which is reducing their energy bills, reducing our emissions and setting us up for the future. So I want to be spending time on that, to be honest.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mike Reader.
Thank you, Chair. Ryan, does the department maintain a risk register of some sort looking at risks to the department not delivering on the energy transition?
Yes. So we monitor on two fronts really. One, we monitor along with our international colleagues the impact of climate change on the UK and internationally, and we publish regularly. We publish, I think, this week the latest greenhouse gas inventory statistics. And then the second monitoring that we do is sort of regular monitoring of our progress against our carbon budgets. On that risk register, would we see the risk of the reduction in public consensus and public buy-in into the energy transition? DESNES's data shows that now 41% of people have a negative view versus 22% positive view of the government's work on energy transition. So would we see that on the risk register? And where would it sit in terms of the challenges to meeting the transition? So it would sit in different places. So we have our public attitudes tracker, which the Minister quoted the 79% statistics from, which has been a long-running source for us to understand how the public are responding. We also do reviews of individual policies and how impacted they are and by public sentiment, and we feed that in, and then that feeds into our wider communications campaigns and strategies. It sounds like there isn't in my previous experience, like a corporate risk register of the things that are impacting with delivery, or does that corporate risk register exist for the department as a single thing that says what are the risks to you delivering on your responsibilities as a department? So we have risk registers for overall net zero transition. That's not departmental only, because the net zero transition impacts multiple different departments. So my team hold the risk registers and the monitoring for DEFRA, DFT and other departments. And then the department has a series of risk registers as well. The impact of the public's perception of net zero impacts different policies in different ways, and that's part of the challenge here, that we're looking at sort of a large macro change to society through our energy sources, through usage.
I guess the department has recognised this challenge of public perception. You published the Energising Britain strategy, but it doesn't seem like it's owned somewhere centrally, this kind of big risk to the transition, or is that an unfair assessment?
I mean, shall I just jump in? Yeah. I think as well, we are obviously monitoring in different ways in terms of, I think it's looking at where the different audiences is. And the way I look at it is there's a sort of national debate and almost at a country level, and then we've got a sort of community constituency level, and then we've got a citizen consumer level. And in a way, we need to be making sure that we are, obviously they all feed and interrelate to each other, but we need to make sure that we're communicating at each of those levels, and there is different risks attached, whether it's to different policies, but to making sure each of those. I think actually nationally we've been making a pretty good argument. I think citizens-wise we're doing a lot of micro-targeting, we're doing a lot of campaigns for citizens. Where I think we are looking to build, and this is part of the Energising Britain and the local power plan, which will come out imminently, is around some of that community area, and I think we will get more engagement there. So it's a really good point in terms of we will go back, because we've also looking at, as Ryan was saying, around the carbon budget and where we are in terms of the risk register on that and delivery within the carbon budget, slightly aside from all of the departmental risks which you can raise the Secretary of State.
It's very positive to hear actually that the department is holding that government-wide risk view of risk. You know, you just referenced the carbon budget and growth delivery plan. Very clearly that relies on other departments. Do you see delivery of the clean energy mission being as a bigger priority to other departments than it is for DESNZ? And perhaps ask you, Minister.
I mean, the clean energy mission is more within our gift than the carbon budgets. As you go through it, we have to be much clearer in terms of with DFT and with DEFRA and other government departments that we're working with. So, Ryan, please chip in, but in terms of the clean energy, the mission is much more within the gift of the department. So whilst we work really closely, and I'm certainly working with other government departments, whether it's DBT or Treasury, to look at where we can take advantage of those co-benefits, because as we power up on this mission, we want to make sure that we are taking advantage of those co-benefits, whether it's investment, UK manufacturing.
I think you're right. It definitely sits with the department, but that climate and carbon budget is cross-government.
Yes.
Do you see as much priority of that in other departments as you do in yours, given that the plan you've just referenced talks about fuel, it talks about transport, the CCC report is very clear, actually housing, transport, etc., the biggest risks to hitting net zero and hitting our climate commitments, not energy at this stage, because we've done great work and we've got to do great work now.
I certainly feel I have strong support from our ministerial colleagues within other government departments, and I work really closely with them, whether it's at DFT, whether it's at DEFRA or MHCLG. I work really closely with them, and I have no reticence in saying they feel as much commitment to this as I do. They feel it's across government.
That's very positive here, thank you.
Can I add some of the structures we put in place to ensure that happens? So the Secretary of State set up a mission board with key Secretary of State and ministers from other departments to make sure that the whole government is pushing towards the Clean Energy Superpower mission, which, as I know he's told this committee before, has two legs: delivering clean power 2030 and accelerating to net zero. So that pulls it together, and he obviously regularly updates the Prime Minister on that. And the fact that we delivered the carbon budget and growth delivery plan at the end of October with a government logo on it, not a DESNZ logo on it, shows that it is a really cross-government effort to deliver that.
Yeah, before you move on, Mike, how well is MHCLG communicating what's happening in housing? How well is DFT communicating the benefits of electric vehicles in significantly lower driving costs, for example?
I think I feel very fortunate to have a Minister of State for Housing who I think previously sat in my job in opposition. So has a strong personal commitment to this. So as I say, I find them incredibly helpful to doing that. We're looking forward to the future home standards coming forward imminently.
Oh, do tell us. What do you know about the
future? So
future
hopefully that will be. But yeah, I feel very supported by my colleagues, and also in other government departments where you might not expect as much. But sort of the Department for Education, we've obviously making sure that climate is on the curriculum more, and we're having the natural history GCSE.
It must be very frustrating, as you mentioned, the Future Home Standard, that we are 18 months into government and we still have house builders who are getting planning consent where they don't have to have energy efficient homes from day one.
I want us to move as fast as we can towards delivering on our target. I also want to make sure that we do things in a thoughtful way and we maximise the co-benefits for Britain. And I have absolute faith in my Minister of State in MHCLG to do that.
Mike.
Thank you, Chair. We've read your Energising Britain strategy and the 5 principles of how the government will work with people, communities, organisations, communicate, listen, enable, grow, collaborate. What are the metrics you're going to use to judge whether that's a success?
I apologise, I was trying to make sure I remembered all 5 of those pillars. I was like, it's a test of like, I'll tell you after which lyrics from songs we can play that game later. But in terms of what are we looking at, so what we've done with the Energising Britain report is we have looked at, I think there was obviously a call in the committee from the Committee on Climate Change that we did more on this. There's also a couple of things when I came into this role of reflecting what is the government's role here and where can we best add value. And in part on that community element, I was saying that where I think we can do more, there is so many incredible projects going on. I've been to Sheffield, I've been to Southway, where people are delivering within their communities. So how to make sure we are shining a light on that. So I think there is...
What are the metrics you'll use to judge whether that strategy is successful?
Generally on our communications strategies, we are looking at obviously overall support, which you've referred to a couple of times, and make sure the support for our policies. And so obviously that's a big collaboration, but making sure that our overall support and is that adding to it. We are then looking whether in terms of in different audiences and what actions are taken as a result of whether it's those campaigns, whether it's around Energising Britain, and I could say support within different constituencies, because, and I mean constituency, I probably should say demographics, not, in terms of whether it's youth or whether it's, different demographic constituencies. So we are looking at that, and then I guess where are those positive perceptions online as well, which I'm sure we'll come on to, but has become an increasing challenge for us.
Yourself, a year ahead, you come back in to see us. The public attitudes tracker says that attitudes are getting worse towards support. What are the actions you think you would have to take?
If in a year's time public attitudes are getting worse, well, I hope to goodness I'm not coming back with that. Look, I think we're acting now. We're not waiting for that attitudes tracker to worsen. And I think things are changing constantly in terms of the thing I've been really struck by is the amount of opportunities and positive stories that are out there. We went to the Vestas factory last week that we intervened with a £20 million loan. It's amazing onshore production factories. There's a huge amount of positivity going on. I think we need to make sure we are maximising that, telling people that story, so they know and feel some pride in Britain, because actually the British story on this is good and we should take some pride in that. I want us to do loads more. So I think we are already taking action, but also as we are in an increasingly volatile geopolitical world, improving our resilience in terms of our energy security, in terms of our food security, in terms of our water security, all of those elements that are co-benefits of tackling climate change put us in a more resilient position. And I think that's something, we all need to consider.
And the participation strategy emphasises collaborating with local authorities. So what specifically are you going to be doing with local authorities to get them bought into what the government wants to achieve?
Ryan and myself, Ryan, you go with the Secretary of State to the mayoral one, don't you? But we have a local net zero delivery group that works with representatives of the LGA, but of councils across the country in UK 100 to look at actually what is happening there. So we're working through that as a delivery body, but also we've got a group of different stakeholders. We've got a stakeholder panel which pulls together climate action outreach, various different stakeholder groups, and they are going to work with us to make sure we can, as I say, celebrate what is actually going on and look at the other way where there are barriers to action in terms of delivering on the crucial targets that we're all, working towards.
Interesting, you just mentioned there's a mayoral panel. Mm-hmm. Does Andrew Jenkins attend the mayoral group?
Put me on the spot because I go. I'd have to check on that. I don't know that off the top of my head.
It leads to my question: where you have authorities that are sceptical of climate change. My local authority, West Northamptonshire Council, run by Reform, they've banned the word net zero. They've banned training on it. They've banned a focus on it. They even withdrew great council projects from awards because they didn't want the council recognised for positive work it had done on climate. How are you going to bring them on board with your participation strategy?
It's an excellent question. I think actually what my understanding is that actually in some areas, certainly in Hull, the experience has been slightly different, that whilst some of the names might have been removed, actually some of the actions have continued and the support, because actually in the real world, take climate change off the agenda. This is good for jobs. This is good for energy sovereignty. This is actually, good for local authorities on multiple levels. So we are finding in some ways people are supportive for different reasons, and I don't really mind why people are supportive. I just want Britain to be, say, greener, healthier, happier and wealthier.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Claire Young.
Thank you, Chair. So I think it's fair to say that public support for renewable energy infrastructure and building out the electricity grid drops. Am I asking that? I'm lost here.
You're due to ask questions on building consent in local communities.
Support for renewable energy infrastructure and building out the electricity grid dropped markedly if they're to be built in their local area. How does the government intend to bridge this gap in support?
It's an excellent question. Absolutely, in the same way as we started off with the chairman saying, we can hold almost two views that might appear to be conflicting. We know that when there's local infrastructure proposed, support can drop for some of that local infrastructure. I think going back to my answer around the community piece, that is an area that I think we have started work on and we need to do more on. We're clear in the department that if the community is hosting energy infrastructure, they should get some of the benefits of that. So we've been working on community benefits. Imminently we will be bringing forward the local power plan, which is hugely exciting, around how again local groups can get involved, and so we will see more of that. That's being done in collaboration with Great British Energy. I think we need to be clear of how, say, we support those communities, and whether there is. I'm also interested in whether there's other methods of participatory, engagement that explain to people what the benefits of this are. And also we need to listen and make sure, going back to the public participation plan, listen and make sure that we are listening to genuine concerns at the same time as we do need to build this infrastructure for our energy sovereignty in the long term.
You've mentioned local benefits.
Yes.
And obviously the Clean Power 2030 Action Plan states communities will see clearer links between local projects and local benefits. What do you actually mean by that? And how will local communities see these benefits?
So the local power plan will come out imminently, so that more will come on that, and so I'm sure when the Secretary of State appears he can give you the detail on that, but it's imminent in terms of actually how that will work in terms of local groups getting involved in energy. We have said around having a community benefit direct Ryan, do you want to say specifically?
Yeah, so last year we published a working paper on community benefits and some of the shared ownership of low carbon infrastructure. We've been gathering information on that, and we're due to set out our next steps in due course. I think, as the Minister said, it's really important that we bring people with us, and as she said, the local power plan is coming out imminently. We've consistently worked on the electricity bill discounts, but we're also working at a place-based level as well as those national interventions. So Great British Energy has a £10 million fund that they invest with the mayors. There's another £5 million Great British Energy fund with local communities. And we've also created a series of net zero local hubs around the country to help bring in investment and support local authorities as they develop clean energy infrastructure. And the aim with that is to show on a local level that the benefits are real, because our evidence shows that, as you say, people are supportive of climate action at a high level. That drops off a bit whenever it comes to specific transmission infrastructure. But the way to build that back up is to explain to them the benefits of it, explain why it's being done, and take them on a journey. And there, as the Minister said, there's more that we need to do with that, working alongside our partners in industry.
Can you explain a little bit more about those initiatives you've talked about? You talked about the money that's gone to mayors and to local community groups. Can you explain a little more about how that is being used, and specifically how that is building support for the transition?
So we were a little bit hamstrung because the local power plan comes out imminently, so we can't say, but we have, as I say, we have recognised that we need to do more around community benefit, and we've made it really clear that communities who host this infrastructure should directly benefit from that.
You've already awarded money. You just set out that you've awarded money for initiatives.
So GBE, Great British Energy, has funding set aside from the spending review and settlement to support this.
It's set aside but not
distributed. I don't think it's all distributed
sorry,
yet. No, sorry. That's the process of the funding.
Just to add a couple of things on that, in terms of we are also, DEFRA is looking at the land use plan, and which will come forward to look at making sure that land is used most effectively, and that will include, align with the energy spatial strategy at the same time, to try and make sure we think holistically more around land use, which I think is exactly what we need to be doing in order to make our country more resilient.
I know there's a particular space for argument when it comes to the land use, because agricultural land graded 1 to 5, but category 3, so 3A is included in best and most versatile, but 3B isn't, and yet none of the maps clarify what's A and what's B, and that's certainly in rural constituencies like mine as a source of arguments when applications are coming forward.
Okay.
Because there are arguments about food security and reserving the best land for producing food.
And we absolutely need to make sure that food security is a key part of this government's agenda. Clearly that falls within DEFRA, but it isn't an issue that we are concerned about. In my communications, I did an interesting interview with Lord Deben, who is obviously the ex-chair of the Committee on Climate Change, also a farmer, who talked positively about solar farms and the temporary structure that they provide. And also, it was good to see Tom Bradshaw, the NFU, saying it allows a diversification for farmers. Of course, we want to make sure, as well as those positives, we are supporting communities to look at those benefits.
So I'm interested in existing energy communities and how we use them to support the transition. So we know the new energy system will have to be more distributed and go to sites where there's not been energy before. As someone who comes from an area, I live within a mile of a small wind farm, a huge substation and 2 nuclear power stations. How do we use existing sites best? For example, in nuclear, I think there's a very live conversation about that. But also, how do we use the experience of existing energy communities to build support for the energy transition in new energy communities?
Oh, what a brilliant question. So in terms of I think, look, we haven't really touched on nuclear. We are very fortunate to have Patrick Vallance as our nuclear minister, who is doing a fabulous job of championing nuclear. And obviously we have a renaissance of nuclear, and we're pushing on all different fronts to make sure that as part of our clean energy mix, but also as part of our economic benefits, this is something where Britain is leading the way, and we have skills that we don't have anywhere else in the world, and quite competitive around us maintaining that advantage. So very keen to make sure we do everything we can on nuclear. I think you raised...
Perhaps I could have a conversation with you later about the semi-urban population density criteria.
Okay.
Because that is a barrier, but possibly not for today.
I will look forward to that.
Sure you will.
In terms of the skills, I think you raise a really good point, and I guess a couple of things I'll say is, look, we all want to learn from what's happened in the past when we have had energy transitions, and we all know that the scars of those transitions are still on many communities up and down our country, and we absolutely want to learn and not have any of those issues when we have this energy transition. We've got the North Sea plan, which looks at how to transfer communities. It was explained to me it's a bit like when people leave the military, we're having a bespoke job service, so actually it's an end-to-end service to make sure we're not losing any of those skills. Because
from a community point of view, sorry, what I was trying to get at was in communities that haven't had energy before, we see support for the clean energy transition dropping when it looks like the stuff's going to be built there.
Yes.
Yet we have communities who already have a lot of infrastructure and who don't care and are very happy with it. How do we use that in new communities to reassure and support those new communities with their absolutely legitimate and understandable concerns?
Yeah, it's a really good challenge, and so I guess I was using the North Sea example as an example of where there will be energy systems still being used. It's a different form of energy, but in Aberdeen we will be, whether it's going from oil to offshore wind, and you've actually got those, pontoons side by side at the same time. So I think it's how we can make sure that transition is happening at the same time. I saw it the other day in a heat pump factory where we had boilers being produced on heat pumps, and then there was a training facility, and it was 5 to 8 days to train from one to the other, but they were both being produced at the same time, and so you could feel that transition. Is there more we could do? Probably, and it might be a great conversation for us to have in terms of making sure we are making use of that. And I was in a meeting the other day, and they said we almost need a call for retired engineers, and I was like, that's actually a great idea, but where are the ideas, you say, of making sure we don't lose any of those skills, or even the unwritten community knowledge that might be able to do it. There may be more we can do. As I say, there's been some great examples I've seen, but very happy to have a further conversation, and if you've got ideas, please feed them in.
Thank you, Chair.
One of the recommendations we made as a committee, Minister, in response to the national policy statements was about community engagement, and it was about the importance of doing consultation well, but above all doing it early as the best way of avoiding the growth of campaigns against new infrastructure being installed. Has the department picked up on those recommendations? Has the department changed its approach in advocating? I know it's often other developers rather than the department in advocating and in encouraging those applying for consent.
We are in a very active conversation at all times to make sure this is we've got a government mission, but how to deliver that is going to be a co-creation to make sure we can do that. Ryan, I'm going to defer to you in terms of whether there's been any practical differences or whether it's a sentiment change to the Chair's point on making sure that in the consultation with the local communities is happening earlier in order to avoid the challenges that we've seen often happen.
So I think we're trying to learn the lessons from previous infrastructure build where there's been the issues that you say, Mr. Chairman, and we're committed to working sensitively and strategically on the upgrades that we need with the network companies, with Ofgem and with others. In terms of the timings for consultations, etc., some of that is driven by the planning system and the processes that go through there. But certainly we're trying to do from the top level, where the Minister and I sit, is explain the rationale and the reason for why we're making this change, and make sure that feeds all the way down to the micro level and the specific level of the infrastructure build and the infrastructure project.
Thank you. The statement, we now have an annual statement to Parliament on the state of climate and nature. Has it led to an increase in confidence and trust in the government's action on climate change and accompanying plans for nature restoration?
I think climate change and biodiversity loss are two sides of the same coin. Many people have said that before, but in terms of clearly there is a strong integration, there's a symbiotic relationship in many ways between those two things. When we came into government, there was a complaint from stakeholders that we weren't making as much we weren't working closely enough together. Mm-hmm. And making sure that those two the policies of reducing emissions and nature restoration are working hand in glove together, we weren't taking advantage of that opportunity. And so that was one of the reasons that obviously the Secretary of State came forward with the previous Secretary of State for DEFRA to do this statement. I think it was very welcome. We had a great turnout within the House, lots of people speaking. I think the Honourable Chair spoke within that, but in terms of we had a great turnout at that event. At that moment, we are now looking at how to build on that. In the public participation plan, we looked at saying we would do more around that moment. Whether it's in local communities or different events, we are exploring that at the moment. But I think we are working closely with DEFRA, both internationally and domestically.
So early days, but you've recognised the challenge and you're planning how you're going to improve engagement.
Absolutely, but as I say, I think I've already witnessed an improvement, but that was underway before I joined the department. I think there's definitely more to do, but I have already witnessed an improvement of us working collaboratively.
Moving on, thank you for that. Moving on, we've already been talking about reducing costs. Is there more that can be done? The Secretary of State in his answer to me at last orals said flexibility in tariffs was an opportunity. Where are we with ensuring that's available? And that already helps with electric vehicle drivers. What's the plan to bring that forward as far and as fast as possible?
It's a really good point, and I think you can talk about electric vehicles and the way that we are now in a system where you can, if you're on the right tariffs and with the right technology, you can take advantage of those opportunities. And we are exploring at pace how we can bring those opportunities and advantages to as many people as possible.
Okay. And we only have 60% smart meter use effectively. Slightly higher take up. We hear that quite a lot of, a worryingly high proportion of smart meters aren't used effectively. How do more people take advantage of flexible tariffs if they can't have access to smart meters?
I think we need to make sure that there's different elements, isn't it? One is around digital accessibility, and for different people they are more digitally accessible and able to use the interface to do this, as you say, making sure we've got the technology in the homes, but also that they are having the right infrastructure and they're using the right equipment, so to speak. So it's on a multiple levels of how to do that, but we're looking at how to do that as quickly as possible, because you say there are advantages for people who are able to access these things, which we want to make sure are actually meeting the communities and citizens who need it most. Is there anything you want to add?
I'd just say we continue to push with the smart meter rollout so that the infrastructure is in place, and then there's a job that sits above that, which is the intelligence and literacy layer, where we have to make it easier for people to access these technologies. So we, as part of Energising Britain, we looked at how we could improve people's carbon literacy and understand the impact of their actions, which helps drive people towards investigating further what energy tariff they're on and taking further action. So it's a combination of both the infrastructure piece, where the smart meter rollout is absolutely essential, and we need to up those numbers, but also then the communications piece and the empowerment piece and the digital divide that the Minister mentioned, so that people feel confident in being able to take advantage of the infrastructure when it's in place.
We're going to see a big government communication plan on telling people how wonderful flexible tariffs are.
As it stands, we're obviously focused on our 3 campaigns, Energising, which I'm sure, Chair, you have seen, about electric vehicles. Thankfully, they didn't ask me to do it, because I don't know if you've seen the hair option, but it's quite extravagant, should we say, around electric vehicles, around heat pumps and around energy efficiency. And we're using those targeted, but that's areas that we really want to see to help people, but also to increase that uptake and rollout as quickly as possible.
What are the channels for getting those across?
Channels in terms of communications channels. A lot of these, as I say, are micro-targeting. So actually we're looking at different demographics. So when we're looking at the energy efficiency, saving up to £150 off your bills, we are going for more vulnerable groups, people, older people, people with young families and people with disabilities. So we are looking at where we need to target those most effectively. And as I say, the opportunity with the online space opening up is that you can micro-target much more. And then we're working with content creators, like I mentioned before, Big John of The Sun, who some people may be familiar with or not, but is very passionate and actually has had a brilliant conversion rate with this. And I think meeting people, like, he's had over 1 million views on social media around his videos, and the conversion rate it's over 40%, the conversion rate of action, which is pretty incredible. So I guess having those, we talked at the beginning about having the right messengers to meet people, to make sure that we're getting that conversion.
Yeah, she might need a different messenger where I'm an MP, but that's another story. There's one of the reasons people give for not wanting to take part in or support the energy transition are that, given the global nature of climate change and the figure that we are responsible for 0.87%, I think, of emissions, what's the point of taking action here? What is the government doing to counter that narrative?
I think the narrative to say that we are only... I think people either believe that Britain is important and has an impact in the world, or they don't. And I am in the former camp, that I think Britain has an impact in the world. And I think the impact of our behaviour is far greater than the amount of our emissions. You know, we sit on the UN Security Council. When we introduced the Climate Change Act, you know, we had tens of countries followed us. The consumption of our emissions goes way beyond the 1%. The impact of the city goes beyond 1% of our emissions. So I would say our impact in the world is far greater than that. And I think that is a massive opportunity for us that we should be not talking about, but acting on and, you know, taking advantage of as quickly as possible, because there is a global race for a lot of these industries and opportunities. And I, for one, don't want us losing out.
Thank you. Graham Downey.
Thank you, Chair. You've touched on a couple of these aspects throughout the session, Minister, but just looking at some of the trust that government carries or doesn't carry when it comes to communications. 2 aspects. One, how much of trying to get people to engage and make different choices with energy transition is about just giving them information versus balancing that with incentives or leading them to a conclusion, I guess is perhaps a different way of putting it. And related to that, who are the other right people to work with in order to drive that forward? Is it industry? Is it where are the other partners as well, the kind of the trusted messengers you mentioned as well, but where's that link between here's what we're trying to incentivize, going back to horrible efforts of previous governments nudging, but how do we nudge people in the right direction, and where do you see that balance between information right through to direct incentives?
I think you make a really good point, and I think one of the mistakes that has been made in the past is there was an assumption that almost people would start at low level green action and then would work their way up. I think most people are completely overwhelmed, have very limited time, and want to know very quickly what is the one thing I can do to help and make sure I've played my part. So I think what we need to do is be really clear, as you say, targeted about what we're asking people to do, how we support them, whether it's around the reduction, £3,750 off EVs, whether it's around the boiler upgrade scheme, around the heat pumps. We need to make sure those two things are very tight together, to your second point. And then in terms of messengers, you're absolutely right that other people carry greater weight than, sadly, as a Member of Parliament do, or the government. And I think it's different people and different voices. One of the areas since I've been in this job, I always respected UK scientists. I'm now completely in awe of them. I think that the UK science is leading the world, and we have some of the most incredible people within our scientific community. They're obviously very trusted voices, but it's just the reason why I so enjoy working with them is because they have the rigour, they make everything, but they've also got the curiosity of how to solve these sort of puzzles. So I think scientists are a brilliant form of doing that. We're lucky enough, we've got a chief scientific advisor in Emily Shukra, who herself has written Ladybird books on climate change, but we have Patrick Valence, we've got a lot of scientists. Again, business leaders are out there. We see some of them making a really passionate case. I'm meeting with many of them to say, can you get out there and actually talk practically about what the opportunities are for their consumers and why they're investing in this?
That was a discussion that I had at a session this morning where there was a reluctance from some businesses in a particular area to get involved in what they saw as an increasingly politically difficult space. How do you encourage them to do exactly what you've said there? So the government is investing in this, it's good for your business, but you need to help us show that it works. How do you incentivize them to really push past that, what they will see as a political element that may be cautious of, and push them through?
As I said, I think there are some people who are peddling climate misinformation, should we call it, or trying to make this an argument. The people, by the way, who are peddling this are backpedaling British interests, I would say, and I'm curious as to why they are doing this. But the vast majority of people, and certainly business leaders I talk to, are very committed to this agenda because they know the science and they know the economic opportunities.
They're willing to kind of help or support government in actually saying to the public, this is, if you don't do that,
yes,
they're saying, if you don't do this, your energy bills will be higher.
So some have come out and said, so some have went out, you'll see some of them in the media, whether it's, have come out and said they are doing this for business reasons, for, reasons their own concerns. Some have done this. We also work on the Net Zero Council, and we have a number of business leaders on there. And I have to say that some of them, whenever they speak, I was like, I wish I could have just filmed you and put that out. But in a sense, I've started interviewing people and putting it up, but because I think some of this is around people think, well, what are you asking me? If I'm asking people to sign up to a target of this and am I doing this? All I want people to do is to explain why they as business leaders are investing in this and what they are concerned about in the future, because their concerns are very similar to my concerns. And so I do think we need to do more to get their voices out. We're working on the Net Zero Council, which we co-chair with, the Secretary of State co-chairs with the CEO of the Co-op, who is very vocal on this. She's very keen to be out. But we have an array of business leaders from Aviva, from Octopus, from SSE, who are on that Net Zero Council. And I have encouraged them, and each of them have come out at various moments. We did the CG, the Climate Growth Budget Delivery Plan. They came out and did it. I want them to do more, and I will be encouraging them to do more, because frankly this has to be a cross-society effort as much as anything.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the other thing is, as someone who did comms for 15-20 years, sometimes the chief executive is not the best message.
Totally.
The chief executive is the best message carrier for something corporate. Often it's someone much further down the list. I understand the value of a chief executive speaking out in a certain column in the Times to really kind of get down. And the slightly moving on from that, how do you get to someone, you mentioned the North Sea and the northeast of Scotland before, how do you get to someone who is perhaps what you call a high information level person but is perhaps still sceptical because they're worried about their own job? What's the right level, do you think, to speak to them? Because they probably won't listen to government either. But how do we speak to them and go, look, this is not only good for your career, we're securing your job, but getting them to think more broadly. How do we get to that person, and what information do you think we can use to speak to them? Because again, as you say, it's got to be a whole society approach, and that kind of the value of turning, if I can use that phrase, that individual who's high information, sceptical, into an advocate would be massive. How do we get to that group?
My first answer would be to listen. I think often it's around listening to what people's genuine concerns are, and sometimes there are genuine concerns and we should listen to those genuine concerns and making sure we're meeting them. But otherwise, sometimes I think it's about reassurance and making that. As you say, who is the right messenger? It's going to depend on the community. Do you know what I mean? It's going to depend on the demographic of the individual. We are strange creatures as humans. We are influenced in different ways. And I think as I have to listen to the climate science, which at times is quite terrifying, I need to be looking at all different ways of getting people to support and explain why we're doing this, and that's what we're doing. What is going to be the right thing for your worker, it will depend on, as I say, demographics, so they are, but we just need to keep doing this. But I think we need to start by listening. This isn't just around us talking, it's around making sure we are genuinely listening. This is not something that can be done to people. We need to do it together, and actually doing it together is where we will realise so many of the secondary benefits, which I think people will be better for all of us. I totally agree with you, by the way, in terms of the right person and I was thinking in terms of CEO, and we were at Valent last week and we had a group of apprentices, and they were, their energy and their magnetism for the green jobs, and actually, exactly. And much as I don't, the CEO was fabulous, but the apprentices stole the show.
Well, it's because they'll listen to each other. You listen to your peers.
Exactly.
Thank you. Yeah, I was at Cavendish Nuclear on Friday, and I met an apprentice and a graduate trainee, and they were incredible. And that they are the people sent out to advocate to the local community to recruit the next generation, well, the same generation, in fact, in their case as well, given the shortages in their sector, which of course is true right across industry. The impact on the workforce of key people in an organisation advocating is huge. I think this follows on from Graham's question. Is this a part of what you're trying to do with leaders in business?
I'm thoroughly enjoying being at this session because it's making me check all of my ideas and make sure. But in terms of absolutely, and I think, look, what has happened under this government, and I pay tribute to whatever the last government's done, and I think we should always take pride in what's happened, but is we have had far more active engagement from the unions. And I think that is something that, whether it's around workforce planning or making sure that there is workforce engagement, the unions are involved in every visit, every plan, everything. So we're making sure we do that. But in terms of workplace engagement, which I totally agree with you, and in a past life did a lot more of, is there anything else we can say specifically?
Yeah, I guess two things to say. So you mentioned sort of the workforce engagement of the trade union. So when the Secretary of State came in, he asked me to set up an office for clean energy jobs to build some of that engagement, and so that's happening. And then in particular through the Net Zero Council, we set up a subgroup, which I know sounds really boring, but led by Chris Howlett from Octopus Investments to look at public participation. And part of what they were looking at was what's the role of communications, both from businesses, mostly businesses at the time, to their customers, to their supply chains and to their workforce, so that we could start to give businesses more information, because I think what's holding a lot of those business back, coming to the previous question, is how much trust can they give in some of the information in the stats. So we've tried to work through toolkits and work with Broadway Initiative, work with Aldersgate Group and others to make sure we've got trusted sources of information that we can use and feed through the trade associations and others to get that message out, because I agree it's really important.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We will come to a close there, as I promised you, 5:10, I think, and
Thank you very much.
kept that promise. Thank you very much to both of you for your evidence. That's the end of the session.